Chapter 1. A Summer Fate Turns Dark. The village green at Marleycombe looked its very best that Saturday afternoon. Bunting fluttered lazily between the oaks, and tables laden with sponge cakes and homemade jams lined the cricket pitch. Children darted between stalls, their laughter mingling with the brassy cheer of the Marleycombe Silver Band. From her place beside the tea urn, Miss Jane Marple surveyed the scene with quiet contentment. A fete, she believed, revealed more about a community than any number of formal gatherings. Here were the alliances and little rivalries of a parish, laid out as plainly as the Victoria sponge on Mrs. Bartlett's trestle table. She exchanged a polite nod with the Reverend Pottle, who was busily attempting to coax a reluctant goat toward the guess-the-weight pen. Nearby, Mrs. Kitty Arkwright fussed over the floral arranging competition, her lips pressed so tightly that they nearly disappeared. Everything suggested the day would pass without incident, until a shriek rose from the far side of the green. Heads turned. The band faltered mid-bar. Two girls, white-faced, stood at the edge of the copse behind the bowling lawn. "There's someone lying there," one cried. For an instant, the fate hung suspended in a stunned silence. Then people rushed forward. The rector, Mr. Bartlett, even young Michael Penrose, who had been selling raffle tickets only moments before. Miss Marple set down her cup and moved toward the crowd with purposeful calm. Through a break in the throng she glimpsed the body, a woman in a pale summer dress, her head resting awkwardly against the grass. One arm lay across her chest, and almost daintily tied around her wrist was a length of scarlet ribbon. Miss Marple's keen eyes lingered on that bright slash of color. It was too deliberate, too carefully placed to be an accident. Already, voices clamored. Questions, denials, speculation. The constable, flustered, began pushing villagers back. Miss Marple said nothing. She knew the first moments after a crime often revealed more than the hours that followed. She observed the trembling hand of Mrs. Arkwright clutching her handbag, the narrowed eyes of Dr. Statham, who had come running from the cake tent, and the curious absence of Henry Lake, the fate's organizer, who ought to have been among the first on the scene. In the soft breeze, the bunting fluttered on, absurdly cheerful above the still figure on the grass. Miss Marple, lips pursed, felt the familiar stir of unease, and just beneath it a quiet certainty. Somewhere among these well-mannered villagers lay the beginning of an answer. Chapter 2. Whispers on the Green. By the time Inspector Harland arrived from the nearby market town of Downshire, the fete had lost all trace of its former cheer. The music had stopped, stalls stood abandoned, and only a handful of villagers lingered in uneasy clusters along the green. The inspector, a broad-shouldered man with a bristling mustache, knelt briefly beside the body. He spoke quietly to Constable Drew, then rose and addressed the onlookers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must ask you to step back and give us room. There's no cause for alarm, but this is now a police matter." His words settled over the gathering like a cool mist. People obeyed, though many cast furtive glances at the patch of grass where the young woman lay. A constable produced a tarpaulin to shield the scene from view. Miss Marple, standing just behind the front rank, folded her hands over the handle of her umbrella. She watched Harland with polite curiosity. She had met him once before at a garden party in St. Mary Mead and recalled that he was sensible, if occasionally inclined to rush to judgment. The victim, it emerged, was Emily Carter, a newcomer to Marleycombe, staying at the old mill cottage on the edge of the village. No one seemed to know very much about her beyond a vague impression of prettiness and a fondness for solitary walks. Mrs. Bartlett was the first to break the hush. "Such a sweet-looking girl," she murmured. "Why, only yesterday she bought 2 jars of my damson preserve. Said she was sending one to her aunt." From behind, Mr. Pottle offered a solemn shake of the head. "Tragedy," he said gravely. She was at morning prayers not 3 days past. Sat near the back very quiet. Others added their recollections in low voices, a smile exchanged at the post office, an errand to the grocer, a note pinned to the parish board seeking work as a companion. Nothing of substance, yet all were eager to contribute some detail, however slight, as though it might ward off the unease gathering in the air. Miss Marple listened without appearing to do so, her pale eyes thoughtful beneath the brim of her straw hat. She noticed how Henry Lake had reappeared, flushed and apologetic, claiming he had been helping the elderly Mrs. Beecham to a chair when the commotion began. She noticed, too, that Dr. Statham's fingers trembled as he examined the ribbon on the victim's wrist, though his face remained professionally composed. The inspector, after taking down statements, beckoned Miss Marple aside. "I remember you, ma'am," he said respectfully. "From that business in St. Mary Mead. You've an eye for the small things. Tell me, did you observe anything I should know?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "At present no more than yourself, Inspector. Only, the ribbon seemed unusual. A touch of ceremony, perhaps." Harland grunted noncommittally, yet she saw his gaze return to the bright scarlet strip before he ordered it placed carefully in an evidence bag. As the afternoon wore on, the villagers drifted homeward in twos and threes, their conversations hushed and urgent. The fate's remnants were quietly dismantled, leaving only flattened grass and a scattering of paper cups where laughter had rung only hours before. Miss Marple, lingering a moment on the edge of the green, felt a faint breeze stir the hem of her skirt. Marleycomb's tranquility had been punctured, and with it the illusion that kindness and neighborliness were sufficient shields against darker impulses. She began the walk back to the vicarage where she was staying, mind busy with impressions: the angle of the victim's arm, the careful knot of that ribbon, the way certain faces had paled or stiffened as they looked upon the body. Long experience told her that evil rarely arrived in a dramatic flourish. More often it crept in quietly, wearing the face of someone known, or believed to be known. By the time she reached the vicarage gate, Miss Marple's expression was as serene as ever. Yet behind her mild blue eyes, thoughts were already arranging themselves with the neatness of skeins of wool set out for knitting. Chapter 3. Questions in the Parlor. By the following morning, a thin mist lay over Marleycombe, softening the roofs and hedgerows as if the village wished to hide its troubles beneath a veil. From the vicarage drawing-room, Miss Marple watched the fog lift slowly from the green. Already she could see Inspector Harland pacing near the spot where Emily Carter had fallen, his dark coat a sharp contrast to the pale grass. Breakfast at the vicarage had been unusually subdued. Reverend Pottle offered grace with grave solemnity, while Mrs. Pottle fussed over the teapot as though a perfectly brewed cup might set the world aright. Miss Marple, spooning a modest portion of porridge, listened with polite interest as they speculated about Emily's life. "The poor child," Mrs. Pottle said. "So young and so little known here. I do wonder if she had family. A niece wrote to me last month," the Reverend added, peering over his spectacles. "She asked whether Marleycombe might be a suitable place for her aunt's holiday." Perhaps this was the same lady. Miss Marple tucked away the remark for later reflection. By mid-morning, Harland had set up an impromptu office in the snug of the Hare and Lantern, the village inn. Villagers were invited, one by one, to provide statements. Miss Marple, though not officially summoned, found a convenient excuse to deliver a basket of scones to the landlord and so found herself seated near the bar, knitting in hand, while the inspector worked. Henry Lake emerged first from the snug, his ruddy face more flushed than before. He paused to mop his brow, casting a swift glance at Miss Marple before hurrying out. Next came Kitty Arkwright, stiff-backed and indignant, insisting she had been arranging chrysanthemums when the alarm was raised. Dr. Statham lingered longer than most, speaking in low tones behind the closed door. When at last he stepped into the bar, Miss Marple noted the faint crease between his brows. He hesitated as though considering a word with her, then thought better of it and departed. The landlord, polishing a row of glasses, leaned closer to Miss Marple. "Never thought I'd see such goings-on in Marleycombe, ma'am. Poor lass. They say she'd a letter in her handbag, but the inspector won't say what it contained." Miss Marple inclined her head. "One mustn't speculate," she said mildly, though she filed away this scrap of information with the others. By noon, Harland called for a short recess. He crossed the room to Miss Marple, eyes narrowing with curiosity at the steady rhythm of her needles. "You've been patient, Miss Marple," he said. "If you've noticed anything about these people, now would be a good moment." Miss Marple smiled faintly, setting down her knitting. "I hesitate to offer theories so soon, Inspector. But it struck me that Mr. Lake seemed, how shall I put it, more flustered than a mere witness might be. Mrs. Arkwright, by contrast, is most determined to emphasize her whereabouts, which may or may not mean anything. And Dr. Statham? Well, he is preoccupied about something beyond the unfortunate girl. Harland gave a short laugh. You've hardly seen half an hour of them, yet you've made more headway than my constable. Oh, I don't know, Miss Marple replied gently. People reveal themselves all the time. In posture, in voice, in how they look when they believe no one is watching. One simply learns to notice. As she returned to her knitting, Harland regarded her with reluctant admiration. Outside, the fog had burned away entirely, revealing a morning of clear autumn light. But to Miss Marple's mind, Marleycomb's picture book calm now lay like a thin crust over deeper waters, waiting for someone to disturb them. Chapter 4. At Old Mill Cottage. That afternoon Miss Marple set out across the lane with her walking stick and a small basket of buttered scones, an innocent enough pretext for a visit. A faint drizzle lingered after the morning mist, silvering the hedgerows. Marleycombe appeared almost too peaceful, as if yesterday's tragedy had been no more than a bad dream. Old Mill Cottage stood at the end of a narrow track beside the river. Its whitewashed walls and low roof suggested centuries of patient service to generations of millers, though now it served as a modest lodging-house run by Mrs. Elspeth Beauchamp. A placard in the window still advertised rooms for visitors. Mrs. Beauchamp herself opened the door, small and wiry, with hair like thin wire and spectacles that caught the dim light. She greeted Miss Marple warmly. Too warmly, Miss Marple thought, for someone recently unsettled by a guest's untimely death. Such dreadful business, Miss Marple, she said, ushering her into a sitting room scented faintly of lavender polish. I scarcely slept a wink. Poor Emily. She was such a pleasant young woman. Miss Marple lowered herself into a chintz-covered armchair, placing the scones on a side table. Indeed, Mrs. Beauchamp. I felt you might appreciate a little company. They spoke for a while about harmless topics. The weather, the church flowers, the coming harvest supper. All the while Miss Marple's gaze moved gently around the room. A pair of gloves lay folded on the window seat. A half-finished embroidery frame rested by the hearth. On a small desk stood a leather handbag, its clasp slightly askew. Emily kept to herself, Mrs. Beauchamp said, stirring her tea with an unsteady spoon. A quiet soul. She read a good deal and liked her walks along the river path. Miss Marple made sympathetic noises, then, after a pause, asked, Did she have many visitors? Not that I ever saw. Only a letter or two, from London, I think. One arrived only yesterday morning. Mrs. Beauchamp hesitated, then added, Inspector Harland took it, of course. Said it might be important. As they rose to look at Emily's small room, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faintest smear of mud on the cottage's threshold, as though someone had entered hastily from the riverbank. Upstairs, the girl's chamber was neat and almost impersonal. A narrow bed, a writing desk, a single vase of late summer daisies. Yet on the desk lay a ribbon spool, matching in color the one tied around Emily's wrist. Miss Marple touched it lightly, noting the frayed end. She said nothing, only bent to examine a pair of stout walking shoes tucked beneath the bed. One sole bore a tiny stone caught in the tread, pale, like the gravel on the lane that led not to the river but to Marleycombe Hall, the grand house on the hill. When she took her leave, Mrs. Beauchamp pressed a paper parcel of scones into her basket. You're kind to visit, Miss Marple. Folks are frightened, though what good being frightened will do I can't imagine. Miss Marple smiled serenely, thanking her hostess. As she walked back through the drizzle, she turned over the details in her mind. The ribbon spool, the stone in the shoe, the hastily wiped doorstep. Small things easily overlooked, but small things, she had learned, often led to larger truths. Across the river, Marleycombe Hall stood quiet, its windows blank against the gray sky. Miss Marple's eyes lingered there before she turned toward the vicarage, thoughts knitting themselves together with quiet precision. Chapter 5. A call at Marleycombe Hall. The rain had cleared by the following morning, leaving Marleycombe washed clean and sparkling. From the vicarage garden Miss Marple could see the hall rising beyond the beech woods, its mellow stone catching the pale sunlight. She had not intended to call there quite so soon, but certain threads, a small stone in a walking shoe, a smear of mud on a cottage step, seemed to draw her naturally in that direction. Carrying a slim volume of poetry she had promised to return, Miss Marple set off along the gently rising lane. She walked at a steady pace, pausing once to admire a clump of late roses, but all the while her mind ticked quietly behind her mild expression. Marleycombe Hall was a gracious building, part Tudor, part Georgian, surrounded by lawns clipped to an inch and guarded by a pair of solemn stone lions. A footman showed Miss Marple into a morning room where Lady Agnes Farringdon was arranging flowers in a tall glass vase. "Miss Marple, how good of you to bring this back," Lady Agnes exclaimed, accepting the book with a smile that was just a shade too bright. "Such a shocking thing about that poor girl." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "I thought a little walk might clear the air, and I did so want to thank you for lending me Keats." They spoke of safer matters first. The roses, the upcoming harvest supper, Lady Agnes's nephew expected from London. Yet beneath the pleasant talk, Miss Marple sensed unease. Lady Agnes's hands trembled slightly as she set the flowers in place, and she seemed oddly reluctant to mention Emily Carter by name. Soon Sir Geoffrey Farringdon entered, tall and spare, his tweed jacket faintly scented with cigar smoke. He greeted Miss Marple with punctilious courtesy and offered tea. When she accepted, he poured with exaggerated care, as if to keep his hands occupied. "Inspector Harland was here earlier," Sir Geoffrey said, once they were settled. "Routine questions, of course. He asked if we knew the young lady. We did not, at least, not beyond seeing her in the village." Lady Agnes nodded but kept her eyes on her teacup. Miss Marple, sipping delicately, allowed a pause to fall before speaking. "One sometimes notices people on their walks, particularly when they pass the same way often. I believe Miss Carter liked to take the path across your lower meadow." Sir Geoffrey glanced at his wife. "Possibly. We don't keep a strict watch, naturally." The faintest color rose in Lady Agnes's cheeks. They moved on to speak of gardening and the weather, but Miss Marple's attention caught a detail. On a nearby side table lay a small box of ribbons, their bright skeins spilling like a painter's palette. Lady Agnes, noticing her glance, closed the lid with a quick motion. "Some trimmings for the Women's Institute Fair," she explained. "Nothing of consequence." Presently Miss Marple rose, thanked them for the tea, and took her leave. As she walked back down the drive, she paused to look over the meadow beyond the hall. The grass there sloped toward the river path, dappled with late daisies. She imagined a figure crossing it alone, the hem of a summer dress brushing the flowers. Her lips pursed slightly. If Emily Carter had walked there, perhaps she had not been entirely alone. By the time Miss Marple reached the lane, she had arranged the morning's impressions with the same quiet order she might give to a tray of seedlings. Lady Agnes's nervousness, the ribbon box, Sir Geoffrey's measured answers. Small things, yes, but they rarely remained small for long. Chapter 6. The Inspector's Report. By Tuesday morning, the sky over Marleycombe had turned a clear, steady blue, as though the village itself wished to banish all shadows. Yet inside the snug of the Hare and Lantern, shadows lingered in the form of unanswered questions. Inspector Harland sat at a table strewn with papers, while Constable Drew, red-faced from a brisk walk, brought in another pot of tea. Miss Marple arrived at Harland's invitation, her knitting bag neatly looped over her arm. The inspector rose politely as she settled opposite him. "Good of you to come, Miss Marple," he began. "I thought you might find it useful to hear what we've gathered so far. Nothing we'd call conclusive, mind you, but some pieces are beginning to show their edges." He consulted his notes. "First, the ribbon. Our laboratory confirms it's the sort used for millinery or gift parcels. Nothing unusual. Sold locally at Mrs. Hewitt's haberdashery and also in Downshire. Second, the letter found in the victim's handbag. Only half of it remained. The rest appears to have been torn away. What remains reads, 'Cannot risk meeting at the hall again. It is too dangerous. If you care for your own safety, burn this.' No signature." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered this. "Interesting phrasing," she murmured. "The writer fears for themselves, yet also for Miss Carter. And there is that reference to the hall." Harland nodded. "Aye, which brings us to the Farringdons. They deny any acquaintance beyond seeing her at the fete or in passing. Both were calm enough, though Lady Agnes seemed, well, nervous. Miss Marple permitted herself a tiny smile. Some ladies are naturally fluttery in moments of unpleasantness, she said. Others become fluttery only when a truth threatens to escape. Harland gave a wry look. That's rather what I wondered. Now, as for Henry Lake, claims he was helping an elderly neighbor when the alarm went up. But the neighbor says she needed no help at all. He also runs the raffle and keeps the cash box, which I'm told is never short, but still. Mr. Lake is a man who enjoys appearing indispensable, Miss Marple observed. Sometimes such persons conceal small failures or resentments behind their usefulness. Harland leafed to another page. Dr. Statham reports the victim died quickly. Blow to the back of the head, likely from something smooth and heavy. No sign she struggled. Time of death between 2 and 3, just before the scream. Then someone must have lured her behind the cops, Miss Marple said quietly, or she trusted them enough to go. Harland poured tea, his expression thoughtful. There's one more point. Statham says the ribbon wasn't knotted hastily. It was tied with a neat little bow, deliberate, maybe a message. Miss Marple took her cup, fingers resting lightly on the handle. People sometimes leave tokens, she said, though more often they wish to send a message than to memorialize. One should ask what this red ribbon wished to say. The inspector leaned back. You make it sound as if the thing spoke. Everything speaks, Inspector, if one listens carefully, Miss Marple replied, eyes serene. As she left the snug a few minutes later, the village lay sunlit and deceptively peaceful. But to Miss Marple, the green looked subtly altered, as though a curtain had lifted just enough to show darker shapes moving behind it. She walked slowly toward the vicarage, wool bag swinging lightly at her side. Threads of conversation, a ribbon spool, a meadow path, the half-letter in Emily Carter's handbag, each settled into its place like pieces of a patient puzzle. Somewhere among them, she felt, lay the reason a young woman had died beneath a bright sky. Chapter 7. Tea with Kitty and Henry. The next afternoon Miss Marple set out across the village green, a soft breeze stirring the first russet leaves at her feet. The fete tables had been cleared away, but a faint mark still showed where the tent pegs had pressed into the grass. Marleycombe looked on the surface, restored to its usual order. Only the lowered voices at the baker's shop and the way curtains twitched as she passed spoke of the unease that clung to the air. Kitty Arkwright's cottage stood just beyond the post office, its windows bright with geraniums. Miss Marple had brought a small jar of quince jelly, a reliable passport to most kitchens. Kitty herself opened the door, immaculate as ever in a crisp blouse, though a shadow lingered about her eyes. Miss Marple, how nice. Do come in, I've just made a fresh pot. The parlor smelled of beeswax and lavender, and every cushion seemed precisely plumped. Over tea and thin slices of seed cake, Kitty spoke rapidly of harmless matters, the Women's Institute meeting, a delivery of wallpaper, the rector's latest sermon, but skirted anything to do with Emily Carter. Only when Miss Marple admired a vase of Michaelmas daisies did Kitty's composure falter. Emily was fond of those, she said, almost against her will. She came by last week asking how to grow them. Such a polite girl. I can't think why anyone would wish her harm. Miss Marple let the word settle, then asked gently whether Emily had mentioned friends in the village. Kitty hesitated, smoothing her skirt. Not friends, exactly. She did ask now and then about the hall, whether they held dances, that sort of thing. I told her Marleycombe isn't grand enough for balls. She laughed, but I had the oddest feeling she meant more than she said. After tea, Miss Marple thanked her hostess and crossed the lane to Henry Lake's small stone house. The front door stood ajar, and Henry emerged from behind it, wiping his hands on a rag. Afternoon, Miss Marple. Terrible business, all this. He invited her into a sitting room crowded with bric-a-brac, photographs of village cricket 11s, an assortment of trophies, a rather gaudy clock on the mantel. Henry talked easily, but his cheerfulness rang a shade too loud. He described the fete in detail, claiming he'd been run off his feet, helping Mrs. Beecham with her raffle ticket stubs. Miss Marple listened, nodding amiably, then asked, as if idly, whether he had known Emily Carter before the fete. Henry paused just a fraction too long. Can't say I did, he said, setting the clock straight on the mantel. Saw her about, of course. Quiet little thing. As they rose, Miss Marple's gaze caught on a strip of red ribbon lying among a jumble of papers on a side table. Henry noticed her glance and snatched it up with a laugh. Oh, that bit left over from wrapping the raffle prizes. I keep odds and ends. A sensible habit, Miss Marple said mildly, though she tucked the image away with care. Back at the vicarage, she sat by the window, knitting set aside, and reviewed her visits. Kitty's unease, Henry's quick hand over the ribbon, the letter that warned of danger at the hall, each was a single stitch. Together they hinted at a pattern, though the picture was still blurred. Outside, the evening light softened to amber, throwing long shadows across the village green. Miss Marple watched them lengthen, her face calm, but her thoughts as precise as the neat rows of wool resting on her lap. Chapter 8. Conversations at the hall. The following morning was clear and bright, with the faintest breath of autumn sharpening the air. Inspector Harland, looking unusually brisk, stopped by the vicarage just as Miss Marple was pinning up a sprig of late roses in a small vase. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I'm off to have another word with the Farringdons. Thought you might care to come along, in an advisory capacity, of course." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "A walk up to the hall would be pleasant, Inspector, though I doubt they'll relish a second round of questions." Harland smiled wryly. "Perhaps not, but I'd rather catch them before they've time to smooth over anything awkward." Marleycombe Hall stood serene as ever, its mellow stone basking in the sun. A butler showed them to the library, a handsome room with dark shelves and a pair of French windows standing open to the lawn. Lady Agnes Farringdon sat at a writing table, pen poised above a sheet of notepaper. She rose quickly, a touch of color flooding her cheeks. "Inspector Harland, Miss Marple. What an unexpected call." Sir Geoffrey entered from the terrace with a newspaper tucked beneath his arm. He greeted them cordially, though a faint line appeared between his brows. Harland dispensed with pleasantries. "I won't keep you long. There are just a few points about Miss Carter I'd like cleared up." Lady Agnes gestured for them to sit. Her fingers worried the edge of a lace handkerchief as Harland spoke. "You've both said you scarcely knew the young woman. Did either of you ever exchange more than a greeting?" Sir Geoffrey shook his head. "Not that I can recall. She was a visitor to the village. We saw her once or twice from the carriage." Lady Agnes hesitated. "I may have spoken to her very briefly on the river path. She admired my spaniel. Nothing more." Miss Marple, serene as ever, sipped the tea that had been brought in. Her eyes rested on the neat arrangement of items on Lady Agnes's writing table. An inkpot, a silver pen tray, and half hidden beneath a blotter, a narrow spool of crimson ribbon. Harland leaned forward. "Were either of you aware that Miss Carter received a letter warning her not to come to the hall?" Lady Agnes's hand tightened on the handkerchief. "No, certainly not." Sir Geoffrey's tone was firmer, but his glance flicked, just once, toward the writing table before he mastered it. "If the letter mentioned us, it was nonsense," he said. "We scarcely knew the girl." Harland regarded them levelly, then changed tack. "On Saturday between 2 and 3, where were you both?" Sir Geoffrey answered first. "I was in the study preparing some estate accounts. Agnes was arranging flowers in the morning room." "Alone?" "Yes," Lady Agnes murmured. Miss Marple set down her cup with the smallest clink. "Such an awkward hour," she observed gently. "One can so easily be quite alone, or quite unaccounted for, if one is not careful." Lady Agnes gave a faint, nervous laugh, but her eyes stayed on the floor. Harland let the silence stretch before he closed his notebook. "That's all for now. I may need to call again." As they left through the great hall, Miss Marple paused to admire an old portrait of a lady with a greyhound. Harland waited until they were outside before speaking. "Well, they're hiding something," he said. "The question is whether it concerns the murder or merely their pride." Miss Marple adjusted the brim of her hat. "Sometimes, Inspector, pride and guilt are cousins. One must look closely to tell them apart." They walked slowly back down the drive, past lawns bright with daisies. Behind them the hall stood tranquil, but to Miss Marple's thoughtful eyes it seemed to wear its calm like a carefully chosen mask. Chapter 9. Along the River Path. The September sun lay warm across the meadows when Miss Marple set out that afternoon, walking stick in hand. She told Reverend Pottle she fancied some air before tea, but her true object was the winding track that led from the green to the river and then curved beneath the lawns of Marleycombe Hall. The path was narrow, shaded by alder and willow, with late dragonflies hovering above the shallows. It was here, Mrs. Beecham had said, that Emily Carter so often strolled. Miss Marple's sensible shoes made little sound on the mossy ground as she walked, eyes alert for trifles others might overlook. A few hundred yards along, she paused. Near the base of a willow lay a broken twig, its splintered end pale against the darker wood. Someone had stepped there recently. The imprint of a heel showed faintly in the damp earth, larger than Emily's slight shoe would have made. Further on she found a handkerchief snagged in a bramble, white linen, edged with a fine red border. She drew it free carefully, noting the faintest trace of perfume. Folding it neatly, she slipped it into her pocket for the inspector. At a bend where the path widened, Miss Marple rested on a fallen log. From here she could see the back of Marleycombe Hall beyond the river, its windows catching the afternoon sun. It was not hard to imagine Emily standing on this very spot, hesitating before crossing the meadow. The girl might have felt she was watched, or perhaps she waited for someone to join her. A movement among the reeds drew Miss Marple's eye. Henry Lake emerged from the opposite bank, fishing rod in hand. At sight of her, he raised the rod in greeting, a shade too heartily. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Didn't expect to find anyone out here." "A beautiful day for a walk," she returned pleasantly. "Any luck with your fish?" Henry chuckled. "Not a nibble. Thought I'd try before supper." They exchanged a few inconsequential words before Henry continued upstream. Miss Marple watched him go, noticing how quickly he avoided her gaze when she mentioned the fete. When he had disappeared around the bend, she stood and examined the ground where he'd stood. A shallow depression marked the grass, and there, half hidden by a tuft of clover, was a short length of crimson thread. She stooped, lifting it between thumb and forefinger. A fiber from ribbon, no doubt, snagged where someone had brushed past. The sun was lowering when she returned to the village, handkerchief and thread tucked neatly in her handbag. The cottages gleamed honeygold in the fading light, and smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys. Yet the piece felt fragile, like china too fine to bear a sudden knock. Inside the vicarage, Miss Marple placed her findings carefully on a side table. She would give them to Inspector Harland in due course, but for now they sat beside her teacup like pieces from an unfinished embroidery, small bright clues awaiting the right stitch to bind them together. Chapter 10. A Question of Ribbons. Inspector Harland arrived at the vicarage just after breakfast, his boots faintly dusted from the lane. Miss Marple was setting a plate of buttered scones before Reverend Pottle, but at once she saw the taut line of the inspector's jaw. "I wonder if I might borrow your parlor, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "I've a few matters to set in order before I call at Mr. Lake's." Miss Marple, demurely folding her napkin, led him inside. Harland placed on the table two objects she had given him the night before, the linen handkerchief and the single strand of crimson ribbon. "You've an unerring eye, madam," he said. "This ribbon matches the tail end of the piece Mr. Lake was using at the fete, or so he claims. I mean to hear more about that." He hesitated, then added with candor, "Between ourselves, Lake's alibi is none too strong. He says he was helping Mrs. Beecham with the raffle, but she recalls him vanishing for half an hour, about the time the girl was last seen." Miss Marple poured him tea with a steady hand. "Henry Lake is a sociable man," she observed mildly. "People of that sort do not always note the minutes as carefully as policemen." "True," Harland admitted, though his brows stayed drawn. By noon he had arranged to meet Lake at the hall, ostensibly to discuss the fete accounts. Miss Marple, invited along as a friendly witness, took the opportunity to admire the autumn roses while the men spoke in the library. Lake greeted them heartily, a little too hearty perhaps, and offered cigarettes. Harland declined and produced the ribbon. "You said yesterday this was leftover from wrapping prizes. Where were those kept?" "In the reading room at the inn," Lake replied. I fetched a roll or two early that morning. Anyone see you take them? Lake frowned. Can't say they did. I'm in and out of the store cupboard often enough. Miss Marple, meanwhile, studied the desk. An open drawer revealed a ledger. Beside it lay a ball of identical scarlet ribbon, frayed at the end as though recently torn. She said nothing, but her blue eyes missed little. Harland pressed on, voice quiet. Mr. Lake, you've said you hardly knew Miss Carter. Yet several villagers report seeing you speaking with her, down by the river path and once near the post office. Lake's laugh was short. Friendly word or two, nothing more. Poor child wanted to learn the lay of the village. Did you arrange to meet her at the fete? Good Lord, no. A silence stretched. The inspector closed the notebook. That will do for now. I may require another word. As they left the hall, Miss Marple remarked in a voice almost conversational. Some people tie parcels with ribbon, Inspector, while others keep such things for sentimental reasons. Harland glanced at her sidelong. You think Lake keeps mementos? I think, she said gently, that we should discover whether Emily Carter had a parcel to collect that day, or a secret to keep. The inspector gave a grunt of agreement. Behind them, Henry Lake watched from the library window, his hand resting on the desk where the scarlet ribbon lay coiled like a small, bright question. Chapter 11. Whispers behind the counter. Morning sunlight slanted through the narrow windows of Marleycomb's post office, turning the rows of envelopes and jars of boiled sweets to gold. Miss Marple entered quietly, setting the bell above the door jingling. Inside, a handful of villagers were already gathered, ostensibly buying stamps or bread, but in truth eager for tidings about the tragedy. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, presided behind the counter, brisk but keen-eyed. Her assistant, a shy lad of 17, darted about with parcels, pretending not to listen. Morning, Miss Marple. Mrs. Price called. Another fine day, though folk don't seem to take pleasure in the sunshine as they ought. A sorrow in a small place weighs heavy, Miss Marple replied, accepting a packet of letters. People find it hard to settle until they understand. That simple remark opened the sluice. Mrs. Arkwright, Kitty's cousin, leaned closer. Mark my words, Emily Carter wasn't the quiet little thing she looked. She'd secrets, you could see it in her eyes. Old Mr. Tewksbury, polishing his spectacles with a handkerchief, snorted. Secrets, pish. That child met her end by chance. Someone startled her on the river path. An accident gone wrong. Mrs. Price lowered her voice. The inspector was in here early. Asked whether Emily collected parcels or letters. I said she had one. Small brown paper packet came Friday morning. She paid tuppence postage and tucked it in her bag. Didn't say where it came from. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her mind. A parcel. How interesting. Did she seem pleased? She asked. More cautious, Mrs. Price said. Looked round the room before putting it away. At the far end of the counter, young Sally Beecham chimed in eagerly. I saw her with Henry Lake once, by the cricket field. He was showing her how to hold a bat. Laughing he was. Father said Henry's too free with compliments. Mr. Lake is fond of being liked, Miss Marple murmured. The door opened suddenly, letting in a rush of autumn air, and Henry himself. Conversation thinned as he stepped up for a packet of tobacco. He nodded at the company, cheerful as ever, but a faint flush crept up his neck when he caught sight of Miss Marple. Morning, ladies. Inspector about? He asked lightly. Out at the hall, I believe, Miss Marple said, her tone bland. Lake tipped his cap and left, but not before casting a quick glance at the ledger on Mrs. Price's counter, as though confirming something. When the door closed, Mrs. Price gave a small sniff. He's been fidgety since that poor girl died. Comes in twice a day, sometimes, asking for mail that isn't there. Miss Marple smiled serenely and tucked her letters into her bag. On her way out, she paused to admire the chrysanthemums in the window. Giving herself a moment to arrange the threads forming in her mind, a brown paper parcel, a red ribbon, and a man who seemed altogether too anxious about the post. Chapter 12. The brown paper parcel. Inspector Harland arrived at the inn just after luncheon, a notebook tucked under his arm. The parlor smelled of beer and wood smoke. A handful of men sat by the hearth with tankards, lowering their voices as he passed. Mrs. Finch, the innkeeper, bustled out from behind the bar, wiping her hands on a spotless apron. "Inspector, I'd just been saying how terrible it all is. I can't believe poor Miss Carter won't be in for her lemonade again." Harland offered a grave nod. "I'm sorry to intrude, Mrs. Finch, but I understand the post office sent a parcel here for Emily Carter on Friday. Would you recall anything about it?" Mrs. Finch frowned, thinking hard. "Parcel? Yes. Small, neat thing tied with red ribbon. She came in that afternoon, quiet as you like, asked if anything had arrived. I fetched it from behind the bar. She looked pleased, but, well, there was a touch of nervousness. She slipped it straight into her handbag and left." Harland wrote carefully, then asked, "Did anyone notice her leaving?" "Only Mr. Lake, I believe. He'd been taking a pint in the taproom and came through just as she went out. Said something cheerful about the weather. I remember because Emily hardly answered. She hurried off as if she'd somewhere important to be. At that moment, Miss Marple entered, as though the errand of returning a borrowed gardening book had brought her. She exchanged a few mild remarks with Mrs. Finch, then, seeing Harland at his notes, joined him in a quiet corner. "A parcel tied with red ribbon," she murmured. "So easily lost in the bustle of a fete. One wonders whether the contents were valuable, or perhaps dangerous." Harland's gaze sharpened. "Valuable? You think someone killed her for what was inside?" "Or," Miss Marple said gently, "for fear of what she knew once she opened it." Back at the vicarage later, they examined what little evidence they had. The ribbon fiber from the river path, the handkerchief, and now the description of that brown paper packet. "We still don't know what was inside," Harland admitted. "Could be anything, a trinket, a letter, money." Miss Marple's needles flashed as she resumed her knitting. "Money is noisy," she observed. "But information, that is the quietest and most dangerous gift of all." They were interrupted by Reverend Pottle coming in with the Evening Post. Among the envelopes lay one addressed to the inspector, marked urgent. He slid it open, brow furrowing as he read. "It's from the county office," he said slowly. "Emily Carter once worked as a shorthand typist in London, for a firm handling private accounts. They mentioned she'd been asked to return certain papers she'd copied. Confidential papers." Miss Marple set her knitting down, eyes bright. "Then perhaps, Inspector, we must consider whether those papers traveled to Marleycombe, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon." Harland looked up, the first spark of a clearer pattern forming in his expression. Somewhere between the fate, the river path, and that simple little parcel lay the motive for Emily Carter's death. Chapter 13. Kitty's Uneasy Memory. A cool, slate-gray morning hung over Marleycombe, the sort that hinted at rain but never quite delivered it. Miss Marple walked up the lane toward Kitty Arkwright's neat stone cottage, a basket on her arm with a small offering of plum jam. She looked, to any passer-by, the picture of neighborly kindness. Only her eyes, sharp beneath the brim of her hat, betrayed the keenness of her errand. Kitty opened the door at once, a little flushed as though she had been pacing. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come in. I was just putting the kettle on." The parlor smelled faintly of furniture polish and roses. Kitty busied herself with cups and saucers, but her hands shook slightly as she set them down. Miss Marple admired the chrysanthemums on the table and made polite remarks about the weather. Only when Kitty had settled did she allow her tone to soften. "My dear, I wondered if Emily Carter mentioned anything on her last visit. Friday afternoon, wasn't it? Before the fete began." Kitty bit her lip, looking down at her folded hands. "I don't know if I ought to say. It seems so unkind to speak of the dead." "Truth is rarely unkind," Miss Marple said gently. "And the inspector's task is made harder if people let loyalty, or fear, tie their tongues." Kitty sighed. Emily came by that day, yes. She said she'd just collected a parcel from the inn and wanted a quiet place to open it. She asked if she might sit a while in my garden. "Did she tell you what was inside?" Kitty shook her head. "She was very private about it. I left her alone for a few minutes while I fetched tea. When I came back, she was standing near the arbor, looking troubled. She said she'd better be off, that she was meeting someone by the river before the fete. I thought she meant one of the young men from the cricket club, though why she looked so pale I couldn't guess. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, though her pulse quickened. Did she say who she expected? No, only that she mustn't be late. She tucked the paper back into her bag. I'm sure it was paper, folded sheets tied up with ribbon, and left almost at once. Kitty hesitated, then added, I did notice something odd as she went down the path. Henry Lake was leaning on his gate, talking to Mr. Tewkesbury about the fete stalls. Emily gave him the briefest nod, but he turned as if to follow her. I told myself I was imagining it, but now... Miss Marple patted Kitty's hand reassuringly. You were quite right to tell me. Little things are often of great value. When she left the cottage, the clouds had begun to thin, letting a watery sun spread over the hedgerows. Miss Marple walked slowly, letting Kitty's account settle into place beside the inspector's letter from London and the faint thread of red found on the river path. Emily had opened papers she scarcely dared carry, and then set off to meet someone who must have known what she held. Somewhere between Kitty's garden and the fete field, the girl's quiet life had collided with dangerous knowledge. At the gate of the vicarage, Miss Marple paused. Across the green she saw Henry Lake speaking with Mrs. Price outside the post office, his hands buried in his pockets. Even at a distance, there was a tension in the way he leaned forward, the eagerness of a man trying to steer a conversation. Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. Marleycombe was full of voices, but the truth, as always, lay in the silences between them. Chapter 14. Shadows in the Library. Inspector Harland arrived at Marleycombe Hall under a pewter sky. The gravel drive gleamed faintly after a night of mist, and the clipped yews stood like sentinels. Miss Marple, invited along as an unobtrusive observer, followed him up the wide stone steps, her umbrella tucked neatly under her arm. Lady Agnes Farringdon met them in the vestibule, a tall figure in dove-grey tweed. She received Harland with a calm that seemed carefully composed. You wish to see the library, Inspector? Of course, though I'm afraid you'll find nothing exciting among our old ledgers. I'd still like a look, madam, Harland said. Miss Carter may have been carrying certain papers before her death. It's possible they concerned the hall. Lady Agnes led them along a corridor where portraits watched solemnly from the walls. The library smelled of leather bindings and faint wood smoke. Autumn light filtered through mullioned windows, striking dust motes into pale constellations. Harland began a methodical inspection, opening cupboards, lifting piles of correspondence, peering behind a screen where umbrellas and walking sticks leaned. Miss Marple, meanwhile, lowered herself into a fireside chair, apparently content with her knitting. In truth, her gaze traveled carefully over the room. The gleam of brass on the writing desk, a faint scratch on the lock of a cabinet, a box of sealing wax left ajar. You keep many private records here? She asked Lady Agnes mildly. Estate accounts, old letters, recipes, nothing of interest to anyone outside, Lady Agnes replied. But she adjusted the clasp of her pearls a shade too quickly. Harland found a small blotter lying askew on the writing table. Beneath it was a single scrap of brown paper, torn at one edge, faintly marked with the remains of sealing wax. Could this be from the parcel? He asked. Heaven knows, Lady Agnes said with a brittle smile. Servants often leave oddments about. As Harland turned to examine the window latch, Miss Marple rose and crossed to a low-side table where a china bowl stood. Inside, amid visiting cards, lay a narrow twist of scarlet ribbon, crumpled as if hastily pocketed and later discarded. She replaced it exactly as she had found it, her expression bland. When the search was over, Harland thanked Lady Agnes and stepped into the hall to jot a few notes. Miss Marple lingered, remarking on the fine needlework of a chair cover. You don't think, Lady Agnes asked quietly, that this dreadful business could touch the hall's reputation? The truth, Lady Agnes, is generally less harmful than whispers, Miss Marple replied. As they left, Harland glanced back at the library door. There's more behind those walls than she cares to admit, he muttered. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. But the heart of the matter may lie not only in what is hidden, but in who felt compelled to hide it. Outside, the first drops of rain darkened the gravel. Harland looked up at the looming facade of the hall, then at Miss Marple's serene profile. "Do you think someone here knew what was in Emily's parcel?" "Someone knew," she said, "and someone feared." Together they walked back toward the village, the hall receding behind them like a house holding its breath. Chapter 15. Mapping the Last Hours. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across Marleycombe Green, gilding the thatched roofs and turning the puddles from the morning's rain into small mirrors. Miss Marple sat at a little table by the vicarage window, a sheet of notepaper before her, knitting pushed aside. On it she had sketched the village in faint pencil strokes. The post office, Kitty's cottage, the inn, the cricket field, the winding river path, and set apart at the top Marleycombe Hall. One by one she marked what was known of Emily Carter's final day. Post office, collected letters and a parcel, Mrs. Price. Kitty Arkwright's garden, opened papers, looked troubled. River path, seen walking, someone following, Henry. Fate Green, laughter, music, the last anyone admits to seeing her alive. She studied the page, frowning slightly. There was a gap between the moment Emily left Kitty's garden and her arrival at the fete. That gap, Miss Marple felt, was where the answer must lie. Inspector Harland arrived just as the kettle began to whistle. He accepted a cup of tea, eyeing the map with interest. "You've been busy, Miss Marple." "Merely arranging the facts," she replied. "People are rather like stitches, Inspector. On their own they tell little. Together they make a pattern." Harland set his hat on the sideboard. "Lake didn't like my questions about Friday. He said he spent the half hour before the fete fetching cider for Mrs. Beecham, but she swears she never sent him. I'd almost swear he meant to keep us looking at the hall instead of himself." Miss Marple nodded. "Mr. Lake enjoys appearing useful. But a man who is everywhere at once may be somewhere very particular indeed." They talked quietly about Emily's parcel, the folded papers, the red ribbon, the scrap of brown paper found in the hall library. Harland grew thoughtful. If she brought those papers here, perhaps someone at the hall feared exposure. But Lake hovers around every corner of this case. He might have been a messenger. Or worse. Miss Marple folded her map. "We must be careful not to decide the matter too soon. There are still small things missing, and small things, in my experience, decide everything." That evening she took a gentle stroll along the green. At the far end, Kitty Arkwright and Sally Beecham were exchanging remarks outside the shop. Beyond them, Henry Lake leaned on the gate of the cricket field, apparently admiring the sunset. Yet when Miss Marple glanced his way, he straightened, as though caught in a thought he'd rather not explain. Back inside, Miss Marple pinned her sketch to the inside of a drawer. The pattern was clearer than before, but not complete. A wrong step now could frighten the truth back into hiding. She must be patient and very precise, if Emily Carter's voice was ever to be heard again. Chapter 16. Sally's half-remembered tale. The next morning dawned clear and brisk, with a promise of frost in the hedgerows. Miss Marple, a small scarf tucked neatly at her throat, walked toward the Beecham's cottage carrying a posy of late roses. Sally, rosy-cheeked and full of restless energy, was sweeping the front step. "Good morning, Sally," Miss Marple called. "I thought these might brighten your mantel." Sally beamed and ushered her guest inside. The sitting room smelled faintly of fresh bread and lavender polish. Mrs. Beecham was busy in the kitchen, leaving Sally to entertain. They sat by the window while a blackbird pecked at crumbs on the sill. Miss Marple began with gentle remarks about the fete, the cakes, the tug-of-war, until Sally's eyes brightened. "Oh, it was grand. Everyone so cheerful. Till later, of course." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "You've such a sharp memory, my dear. I wonder, did you see much of Emily Carter that day?" Sally tilted her head, thinking. "I saw her by the lemonade stall, just after I took over from Kitty. She looked as if she'd been running. Her hair was all flyaway. Henry Lake was nearby, talking to Mr. Tewkesbury about the duck race. When Emily passed, Henry stopped mid-sentence and went after her. He followed her." Miss Marple asked mildly. Not far, Sally said quickly. He only spoke a word or two, then came back smiling, but it looked forced. Miss Marple allowed a thoughtful silence, then asked, "Did you notice if Emily carried anything?" "Yes." Sally's eyes widened. A little envelope, folded over twice. She tucked it into her bag when she saw me watching. I thought it might be a note for the raffle, but she didn't put her name on the list. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on her lap. "An envelope, you say? Did you see where she went after that?" Sally hesitated. "Toward the far edge of the green, near the gate to the river path. I remember because the band was tuning up, and she looked back as though listening." Miss Marple smiled, handing the girl the roses. "You've helped more than you know, dear." Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple laid the new piece alongside her growing mosaic. The parcel at the inn, the folded papers in Kitty's garden, the ribbon at the hall, and now a plain envelope glimpsed by an observant child. Emily had carried something light enough to slip into her bag, but heavy with consequence. Someone, perhaps more than one, had watched her take it toward the river path. That evening, as the vicar poured tea, Miss Marple gazed at the quiet street beyond the window. Marleycombe looked as placid as ever, but she could almost feel the undercurrent of secrets running beneath the cobblestones, waiting for the smallest prod to send them spilling out. Chapter 17. Questions at the Hall. Inspector Harland arrived at Marleycombe Hall just after luncheon, his notebook tucked neatly into his jacket pocket. A thin mist clung to the lawns, softening the red bricks and lending the place a brooding air. Miss Marple, invited under the pretext of assisting with recollections, accompanied him, her eyes as mild as ever. Inside, Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper, stood stiff as a broom by the oak sideboard. Two maids hovered behind her, whispering until Harland's glance silenced them. "We'll keep this brief," Harland said. "I need each of you to tell me where you were on Friday afternoon, between 3 and 4:30. Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips. "I was in the still room, sir, making up cordial. Polly was polishing the silver in the dining room. Elsie was hanging sheets to air in the laundry." Miss Marple smiled kindly at the maids. The fete made for quite a day, didn't it? All that excitement. Elsie bobbed a curtsy. "Yes, ma'am. I heard the band practicing from the laundry window." Harland asked if any of them had seen Miss Carter that day. Polly shook her head. Elsie, after a pause, said she'd glimpsed someone crossing the back lawn. "Might have been Miss Carter," she murmured. "She had a scarf, pale color. Went towards the library wing." Harland scribbled a note. "Did you tell anyone?" "No, sir. Thought she'd been invited in." Mrs. Weatherby interjected sharply. "Miss Carter would hardly come here without calling. We've always kept good order." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the polished floorboards, where a faint smear led from the hall toward the library, a trace of damp earth, perhaps from boots on Friday's wet grass. She filed the image away. Harland dismissed the staff and turned to Miss Marple. "It puts her at the hall, all right. Question is why, and whether she left again." Miss Marple gently fingered the lace edge of her handkerchief. "The question, Inspector, is also who expected her." They moved to the library. Afternoon light filtered through tall windows, striking the leather-bound volumes. Harland examined the writing desk where the scrap of brown paper had been found. Miss Marple drifted toward a low side table. A tiny thread of crimson wool clung to the carved leg, almost invisible against the dark wood. She bent as if admiring the grain, plucked the thread delicately, and slipped it into her handkerchief. "Another ribbon?" Harland asked, noticing. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her expression unreadable. "Or perhaps a reminder that threads, Inspector, have a habit of leading one somewhere." As they departed, she glanced back at the great house. Its windows reflected the mist, blank and secretive. Somewhere behind them, she felt, someone was holding tightly to a story, and fearing the moment it would unravel. Chapter 18. Henry Lake's Uneasy Afternoon. Henry Lake stood by the open stable door, polishing the brass fittings on a saddle that hardly needed it. Beyond, the paddock shimmered faintly in the noon sun, yet his hands moved too fast, the cloth squeaking against metal. From the house came the muffled sound of the telephone ringing, then stopping. He muttered a word under his breath and set the saddle down. Ever since the fete, Inspector Harlan's questions had begun to settle on him like a damp cloak. He could almost hear them again. Where were you between 3 and 4? Did you speak to Miss Carter? Each query polite but edged. Footsteps approached over the gravel. Henry tensed, but it was only young Billy, the boot boy, carrying a message. Miss Marple's in the garden, sir. Asked if you'd spare her a moment. Henry hesitated, then forced an easy smile. Of course. Tell her I'll be along. Miss Marple was waiting among the rose beds, apparently absorbed in deadheading blooms. She looked up with mild delight. Ah, Mr. Lake. I hoped you might help me settle a little puzzle about Friday. Henry felt the sun too warm on the back of his neck. A puzzle, ma'am? Yes, she said, snipping another bloom. Emily Carter was seen carrying an envelope across the green. Later she may have come to the hall. I wondered if you noticed her while you were about your errands. He shook his head quickly, then slower, trying to look thoughtful. No, I can't say I did. Though I might have passed her near the duck-race stalls. Busy day. Miss Marple laid the rose stem aside. Busy indeed. So easy to lose track of small moments, unless, of course, one is looking for someone. Henry caught himself before frowning. You think she meant to meet someone? It's only an idea, Miss Marple said softly. But I have found that people seldom walk straight into danger without an invitation. Her gaze rested on him, clear, calm, and far too steady. Henry laughed a little too loudly. I wouldn't know about that, ma'am. I just keep the hall running. She thanked him kindly and wandered away toward the yew hedge. Henry watched her go, unease tightening his stomach. She had said nothing accusing, yet somehow he felt examined, weighed, and set aside like an account not quite in order. Later, inside the tack room, he poured himself a quick measure from a flask hidden behind the feed bins. The whiskey steadied his hands, but not his thoughts. Emily Carter's face rose in memory. Her anxious glance, the envelope in her fingers, the moment she'd whispered something he couldn't quite block out. A crunch of gravel outside snapped him alert. Inspector Harlan's voice drifted through the doorway, genial on the surface, but purposeful underneath. Henry slipped the flask away and straightened his jacket. The inspector was closing in, and the old lady, that quiet knitting woman, was watching everything. He would have to be very careful indeed. Chapter 19. Harlan's Gentle Trap. Inspector Harlan chose a steady, deliberate pace as he crossed the hall courtyard. The autumn light had grown thin, and a cool wind pressed fallen leaves against the flagstones. Inside the tack room, Henry Lake was arranging brushes in neat rows, an order that looked, to Harlan's eye, a touch too careful. Afternoon, Mr. Lake, Harlan said mildly, closing the door behind him. Thought I'd check a few details. You've been most helpful already. Henry straightened, rubbing his palms on his trousers. Of course, Inspector. Anything for the investigation. Harlan leaned against the stall post, notebook open but pen still. Last time we spoke, you mentioned seeing Miss Carter near the stalls at the fete. I wondered if you might recall anything more about that meeting. Meeting? Henry laughed, short and sharp. I only passed her. She looked flustered, but a lot of folk did. Indeed. Harlan flipped a page. Several witnesses place you walking after her for a moment. Nothing wrong with that, naturally. Unless you followed her farther than you've admitted. Henry's hand stilled over a currycomb. You're saying I'm saying, Harlan interrupted gently, that the time between Emily leaving the fete and her appearance near the river is rather narrow. And someone, perhaps the same someone, was seen close behind. He let silence gather. The horses shifted in their stalls, hooves thudding softly. Henry looked away first. I went as far as the gate, he muttered. Only to see if she was all right. She said she'd found something that might put things right. Sounded queer. I told her not to talk like that and went back. Harlan noted the words carefully. Put things right, eh? Did she say with whom? Henry shook his head, color rising. No. And I didn't ask. That envelope she carried. You didn't see what was inside? Henry's eyes flickered. Nothing, Inspector. A small sound behind them made both men turn. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, shawl gathered, expression serene. "Forgive me," she said. "I came to return a book Mrs. Weatherby lent me. I didn't mean to intrude." Harland smiled faintly. "Not at all, Miss Marple. In fact, perhaps you can help. We're trying to understand what Emily meant by putting things right." Miss Marple's gaze rested on Henry for a fraction too long. "Such phrases often belong to those who have been wronged, or who know of a wrong done," she said softly. "One hopes the wrong was not beyond repair." Henry shifted, brushing at his sleeve though no dust clung there. When Miss Marple left, Harland closed his notebook. "Mr. Lake, I dare say we'll speak again soon. Until then, I'd stay close." Outside, Miss Marple walked slowly along the gravel path, head bent as though absorbed by the roses. In truth, she was arranging the final stitches in her mind. Emily's envelope, the red ribbon, the slip of wool in the library, Henry's unsteady answers. Soon the tapestry would be complete, but only if she let the threads tighten a little more around the guilty hand. Chapter 20. A Thread Pulled Tight. The following morning Marleycombe woke beneath a pearly mist. Smoke from cottage chimneys lay flat across the gardens. Even the hall's towers seemed blurred, like a watercolor left in the rain. Miss Marple, seated at her vicarage writing desk, placed 3 items neatly on the blotter: a scrap of brown paper, the sliver of crimson wool, and a pressed rose petal Sally Beecham had given her as a keepsake from the fete. She studied them as if they were moves in a game of chess. Across the lane, a cart rattled past, carrying pumpkins bound for the market. Miss Marple set down her teacup, reached for her knitting bag, and tucked a small note inside. Then she slipped the crimson thread into an envelope, addressed to Inspector Harland, with a few words in her steady hand. "Time to let the cord tighten. Please come to the hall library at 4 J.M. At 3:45 she arrived at Marleycombe Hall, ostensibly to return a borrowed gardening book. Henry Lake met her in the hall, stiff with politeness. She thanked him and mentioned she had arranged to meet the inspector in the library. As he led her along the paneled corridor, she sensed tension humming off him like a wire drawn too taut. Inside, Miss Marple settled into a chair by the hearth, her knitting clutched but idle. Henry hovered near the door, arms folded. "I expect you've had a busy day," she said pleasantly. "Plenty to do," he replied, eyes on the fire. "I've mended tack, fetched parcels, the usual." Miss Marple allowed a tiny smile. "Parcels, yes. Curious how many parcels made their way through the village last Friday. Emily Carter's among them. I suppose whoever took hers might have been quite desperate, knowing what it contained." Henry's head jerked. Then he forced a laugh. "You seem to know a lot, ma'am." "One learns by watching," she said mildly. "And by listening. Emily came here for a reason, Henry. She believed someone would put things right." Before Henry could answer, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Harland appeared, cap in hand, and nodded to Miss Marple. She gestured to the table where she had laid a length of red ribbon, retrieved from her knitting basket that morning. "I found this tucked behind the desk," she said. "Odd, isn't it, how the smallest scraps linger after a hurried act?" Harland's gaze shifted to Henry, who had paled. "Mr. Lake," the inspector said quietly, "perhaps you'd better sit down." Henry did not move. His fingers clenched against the doorframe, the knuckles white. Miss Marple watched him gently, almost sorrowfully. "There's no need to run," she said. "No one here wishes you harm. We only wish to know what Emily Carter tried to tell us before it was too late." The clock on the mantel ticked, steady and inexorable. Somewhere outside, a rook cawed into the stillness. Henry swallowed hard. I didn't mean." But he said no more. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the needles whispering softly. The web was nearly complete. All that remained was to let the final strand fall into place.